It was 11:45 at night, and I was covered in mahogany dust, sanding a joint my father said was too difficult to save. That's when I saw it, a crumpled piece of paper in the trash can I was emptying. It wasn't trash. It was a signed and notarized deed of assignment, dated 3 years ago. My parents had secretly signed over the entire family business to my brother, Royce. I stood there holding 15 years of my sweat-soaked investment in one hand and their betrayal in the other. I didn't scream. I just understood that I hadn't been building a legacy. I had been working for free. To understand why I didn't set fire to the building right then and there, you have to understand my family's structure. My brother, Royce, had an MBA and hands as soft as wet clay. He spoke in buzzwords talking about synergy, scaling up and pivoting. He wore expensive loafers into a workshop that smelled of sawdust and solvent. I, on the other hand, had hands that looked like a map of every mistake I had ever made and fixed. I had chemical burns from stripping varnish and calluses thick enough to strike a match on. For 15 years, I was the one who arrived at 5 a.m. to warm up the glue pots. I was the one who could tell the difference between red oak and white oak just by its smell. My father, Marshall, was the founder, the face on the brochure. My mother, Lillian, handled the books and the social life, but I was the one who actually did the work. I was the one restoring the shelving for the historic library, a contract we had just won, worth between $75 and $125 million. But in my family, competence was an invisibility cloak. There's a psychological concept called the glass child. It usually refers to the sibling of a sick or disabled child, the healthy one who gets overlooked because they don't demand anything. But in family businesses, there's a variation, the invisible workhorse. I was the load-bearing wall. I was solid. I held up the roof. I never cracked, never complained, and never needed attention because I was essential. I became part of the infrastructure, unseen and unthanked. Royce, however, was the chandelier. He was fragile, expensive, and the first thing my parents showed off when company came over. He was shiny and needed constant polishing and attention. My parents spent their energy managing his ego and funding his failed investments in digital currencies, assuming I would always be there to pay the electricity bill. They ignored me because they knew I wouldn't go anywhere. They mistook my reliability for a lack of ambition. Finding that paper changed everything in an instant. I understood that keeping the secret for 3 years wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. They knew Royce couldn't run the workshop. He couldn't tell a chisel from a screwdriver. If they had told me the truth 3 years ago, that the business was his and I was just the help, I would have left. And if I left, the profits would stop. So they let me believe I was earning my inheritance. They let me work 80-hour weeks thinking I was investing in my own future, when I was really just fattening the calf for the golden child. I looked around the silent workshop. I saw the tools I had bought with my own money because my father said the budget was tight. I saw the prototypes I had designed in the early hours of the morning. I saw the life I had built on a foundation of lies. My father always said that a good joint depends on tension and pressure to hold together, but he forgot that if you apply too much pressure in the wrong spot, the wood doesn't bend, it breaks. And standing there in the midnight silence, I finally broke. I didn't storm into my parents' room. I didn't wake up Royce to demand an explanation. That would have been emotional, and I was done with emotions. I waited until 2 a.m. when the house was quiet. Then I got to work. I didn't steal a single thing that belonged to the business. I only took what was mine. I packed my chisels, my pull saws, and the special hand planes I had bought with my own savings over the last decade. Then I went to the office computer. I didn't delete the company's data. I simply removed the folder labeled Daphne's Custom Designs. Every computer-aided design file, every blueprint for the historical restorations, every template for the high-end joinery that landed us our best clients. I deleted them from the server and wiped the backups. They weren't company property. They were my intellectual property, created on my own time. If Royce was the owner, he could surely create his own templates. I placed my workshop key in the center of my father's desk. Next to it, I left a yellow, sticky note with 5 words. "Good luck with the sawdust, Royce." I walked out the back door and drove away. I didn't look back. The next morning, the silence was broken. My phone started vibrating at 7:15 a.m. First, it was a text from my mother. "The client is here early. Where are you?" Then a missed call from my father. Then 3 more. By 8:30, the messages went from annoyed to desperate. "Daphne, answer. We can't find the plans for the library restoration." "Daphne, stop playing games." I didn't answer any of them. I sat in a small diner on the edge of town, staring into a cup of black coffee. For the first time in 15 years, my hands were clean. There was no dust under my fingernails. But as I sat there, I felt a strange, physical ache in my palms and forearms. It was the phantom pain of a severed limb. My body was so used to the rhythm of the work, the push of the plane, the resistance of the wood, that being still felt like an injury. But as I watched the screen light up with another desperate call from Royce, I understood the pain wasn't from losing the work. It was the feeling of a toxic limb finally being cut off. It hurt, but the gangrene was gone. To understand why my family thought they could survive without me, you have to go back to a dinner we had 6 months ago. It was a celebration for Royce finishing his MBA. He sat at the head of the table, swirling a glass of red wine, lecturing me on the inefficiency of my methods. He used words like scalability, automation, and composite materials. He told my father that the future of the workshop wasn't in restoration, but in mass production, using cheaper imported wood and CNC routers. He called my work old-fashioned and quaint. My parents nodded along, mesmerized. They looked at him with a reverence they had never shown me. It wasn't just favoritism, it was a psychological phenomenon known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. Because my parents didn't know how to do high-level fine woodworking, they only handled the administrative side. They lacked the competence to evaluate Royce's incompetence. To them, his confidence looked like expertise. They mistook his buzzwords for strategy. They believed that because he could make a spreadsheet look pretty, he knew how to make wood bend without breaking. They truly thought the craft was the easy part and the management was the real work. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson about reality. Back in the present, the tone of the messages on my phone changed. The frantic requests for blueprints stopped and were replaced by the familiar rhythm of manipulation. My mother sent a long text. "You are hurting the family. This is incredibly selfish. Your father is stressed, and it's affecting his heart." Then came Royce. "Stop being dramatic. We don't even need your tools. We're switching to a new supplier anyway. Just send the passwords to the client database, or I'll sue you for theft." I stared at the screen. Theft. He was accusing me of stealing intellectual property that lived in my own head. I didn't reply. I didn't defend myself. I blocked their numbers, one by one. I didn't feel guilty about my father's stress. Stress is a byproduct of poor management, and he had just appointed a manager who thought pine was a hardwood. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and stepped out into the cold morning air. I was unemployed, professionally homeless, and completely alone, but I wasn't afraid. I knew something they didn't. I knew that wood doesn't lie, and neither does the market. The silence lasted exactly 48 hours. Then, my personal cell phone rang. It wasn't my family, it was Bennett, the lead architect on the historic library project. He was the man holding the keys to the contract worth $75 to $125 million that was supposed to fund Royce's new era. I answered on the second ring. "Daphne," he said, his voice sharp and cold. "I'm standing in the workshop. Your brother just tried to explain to me why we should use a chemical stain on 200-year-old oak instead of the traditional beeswax finish you specified. He called it more cost-effective." I walked out. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "I'm sorry, Bennett. I don't work there anymore." "That much is clear," he replied. "I didn't hire a building, Daphne. I didn't hire a brand name. I hired you. You're the only one in the state who knows how to restore those shelves without destroying them. If you're not on the project, the contract is void." "I don't have a workshop, Bennett. I don't have the space to take on a project of that size." Find one, he said. I'll give you an advance for materials, but I need to know right now. Are you a real woodworker, or were you just an employee? It was a challenge. It was a lifeline. I drove to the outskirts of town to an old, cold barn I had passed 1,000 times. It had a dirt floor in some places, and the wind whistled through the boards, but it was dry and it was empty. I called the owner and rented it on the spot with the last of my savings. I spent the next 3 days leveling the floor and hooking up a generator. It was brutally cold. My breath turned to fog as I set up my workbench. But when I made the first cut on a piece of freshly planed wood, the sound was different. It wasn't the sound of labor, it was the sound of ownership. Building a business from scratch involves a mountain of paperwork that has nothing to do with wood. I spent my nights arranging for liability insurance, setting up my own limited liability company, and making sure my supplier contracts were airtight. I asked a friend from high school, who now worked in commercial real estate law, to run a public records search on my new barn lease, just to be safe. 2 days later, she called me. She didn't want to talk about the barn. She wanted to talk about my family's business. "Daphne," she said, her voice dropping to that professional whisper people use when they're about to deliver bad news. I did a check to make sure there were no clauses tied to the property records that could prevent you from working on your own. I found something you need to see. I drove to her office, expecting a zoning issue or a forgotten permit. What she slid across the desk was a notice of potential foreclosure. It turned out the property transfer from 3 years ago wasn't the only secret my family had been keeping. 6 months ago, while I was sanding floors and managing the workshop's cash flow to keep us afloat, Royce had convinced my parents to mortgage the commercial property, the land, the building, my grandfather's legacy, as collateral for a huge, high-interest business loan. The documents showed the funds were wired to a tech growth fund I instantly recognized from the news. It was a digital currency trading platform that had collapsed last month. The money was gone, vanished, but the debt was still there. The asset my parents thought they were protecting for their golden child was actually a ticking time bomb. The family business was technically insolvent. They didn't just have a new, incompetent owner. They had a mortgage they couldn't possibly pay without the income from the contracts I had just taken with me. I sat in my car in the parking lot staring at the photocopy of the lien. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. If I had stayed, if I had accepted their generous offer to be a manager later on, I would have spent the next 20 years working to pay off my brother's gambling debt. I would have been the engine in a sinking ship, shoveling coal while they steered us straight into an iceberg. For the first time, the anger completely evaporated, replaced by a deep, terrifying relief. I hadn't just left a job, I had escaped a burning building seconds before the roof caved in. Winter fell hard on the valley. My barn wasn't properly insulated yet, so I worked in a thick wool coat, my breath hanging in the air as I carved the cornices for Bennett's library. The cold kept me sharp, the silence kept me focused. Then, the inevitable happened. The sound of a car crunching on the frozen gravel of my driveway broke the rhythm. I didn't need to look out the window to know it was my father. Marshall stood in the doorway of the barn. He looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. His shoulders, usually squared with a patriarch's pride, were slumped. He didn't look at me. He looked at the work on my bench, the flawless dovetails, the perfectly matched grain. He recognized the quality. It was the quality that used to pay his bills. "We missed the deadline for the Jimenez account," he said, his voice rough. "The bank is calling every day. Daphne, Royce. Royce is in over his head. I kept planning a piece of walnut, the shaving curling up like a ribbon." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, my voice steady. "We need you back," he said, stepping all the way inside. "Your mother is sick with worry. We're willing to make a deal. You come back as workshop manager. We'll give you 10% equity. 10%, Daphne. That's generous." I stopped working. I set the plane down on the table. I turned to face him. The audacity was brutal. They were offering me 10% of a crater. They wanted me to come back, use my labor to pay off the loan that had destroyed the business, all while reporting to the brother who had signed the papers. "I know about the loan, Dad," I said. The color drained from his face. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "I know Royce mortgaged the property," I continued calmly. The facts were cold and lethal. "I know the money is gone. I know the workshop is worthless. Can we save it?" he pleaded, desperation cracking his voice. "With your hands, with your speed, we can work our way out of this. It's your inheritance, Daphne." In that moment, I felt the final stitch of the surgical removal, the guilt, the obligation, the desperate need for his approval. It all fell away. I understood that saving them would mean destroying myself, infecting my new life with their gangrene. "I'm not the heir, Dad," I said, picking up my chisel. "I never was, and I am not your savior." I looked him straight in the eye. "I'm the competition, and I'm winning." He stood there for a long time, a ghost in a graveyard of his own making. Then he turned and walked out into the cold. I didn't watch him go. I turned back to the wood. 6 weeks later, the family business went up for auction. I didn't go to watch the foreclosure, and I didn't go to gloat. I went for one reason only. I stood at the back of the cold, echoing warehouse as the auctioneer sold off the industrial saws, the dust collection systems, and the fleet of delivery trucks. Strangers bought the infrastructure of my childhood for pennies on the dollar. I saw my parents near the exit, huddled in their coats, arguing in low voices with Royce. They looked small. They looked like people who bet their legacy on a buzzword and lost. When Lot 42 came up, I raised my paddle. It was a heavy, scarred workbench made of solid oak, covered in burns and gouges. It wasn't worth much to anyone else. It was too old-fashioned. But it was the bench my grandfather had built by hand. It was the bench where I learned to cut my first dovetail. I bought it for a few $100s and arranged to have it delivered to my barn. The next morning, I walked away from the auction without speaking to my family. I didn't need their apology. I didn't need their recognition. Closure wasn't in their words. It was in my actions. Today, my barn is no longer cold. I had radiant heating installed last month. I have a team now, 3 apprentices who know that the quality of the joint matters more than the speed of the cut. I teach them what my grandfather taught me. Respect the material, and it will hold you up. The workbench sits in the center of the workshop, a constant reminder that a legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you build, day by day, with your own 2 hands. I am not the heir to a name. I am the heir to sawdust and sweat and the silence of good work. And for the first time in my life, I know exactly what I am worth.